Welcome, everyone. If you're just now connecting, we will start in 1 minute to allow for participants to log on, and thank you so much for joining. So again, thank you for joining us. I am Kate Kuzminski, Senior Fellow and Program Director of the Military Veterans and Society Program at the Center for New American Security. CNAS is committed to bold, innovative, bipartisan research that drives national security policy forward. The Military Veterans and Society Program focuses our research on military personnel, veterans, and the civil-military relationship. Our program explores how the military services can access, recruit, and retain the talent necessary to fight and win the nation's future wars. As part of our research, we examine the effect of policies, practices, and elements of service culture that enable or constrain the service's access to talent. We further explore how the services and DoD may draw from a talent pool that reflects the society from which it is drawn, particularly as there's a limited pool of qualified candidates for military service. A key part of our mission is to elevate underrepresented voices and perspectives of service members and veterans in order to provide perspective and a human element to our research. Today, I'll be moderating our panel discussion, and we will also be taking audience questions throughout the course of the panel. You'll be able to submit your questions through the event page at cnas.org, and we'll address them towards the end of today's event. Thank you so much to all of you for joining on this virtual panel discussion with commissioners from the Department of Defense's Internal Review Commission on Sexual Assault in the Military. The presence of sexual assault and sexual harassment in the military severely hinders military readiness and has grave effects on the recruitment and retention of highly skilled and motivated service members and prospective service members. At the direction of the President, on February 26th of this year, Secretary of Defense Austin established a 90-day independent review commission on sexual assault in the military. The cross-functional 13-member commission was tasked with the monumental job of meeting with key stakeholders in DoD, the military departments and services, and external organizations to seek perspectives from individuals who would be most impacted by the commission's findings and recommendations: commanders, enlisted service members, and survivors. The commission took into account the perspectives of those still serving, those who recently separated from service, and veterans. The commission delivered their report publicly on July 2nd. The commission provided findings and recommendations across 4 key lines of effort: prevention, accountability, climate and culture, and victim care and support. While the most attention has been paid to the recommendation to remove sexual harassment and assault cases from the chain of command and hand them off to independent military prosecutors, the Commission provided 79 other recommendations worthy of attention, particularly in the areas of climate and culture and victim care and support. We are fortunate enough today to be joined by 2 of the commissioners who focused on these 2 aspects of the study. Dr. Kyleanne Hunter contributed significantly to issues of climate and culture, and Kayla Williams contributed significantly to the study's focus on victim care and support. We will open up our time today with a discussion with Dr. Hunter and Ms. Williams, who will provide an overview of the Commission's process, findings, and recommendations. We will then extend our discussion to include Dr. Coreen Farris of the RAND Corporation and Tchen from Time's Up. Dr. Ferris was part of the landmark study team at the RAND Corporation that quantified the impacts of sexual assault in military readiness and retention. Tchen serves as the president and CEO of Time's Up Now and the Time's Up Foundation, known for their work countering sexual harassment and sexual assault in civilian and private sector places of employment and education. Prior to joining Time's Up, Tina served as the executive director of the White House Council on Women and Girls and the chief of staff to First Lady Michelle Obama. So first, we are honored to be joined by independent review commissioners Dr. Kyleanne Hunter and Kayla Williams. So for Kayla and Kai, first, the commission's work was extremely comprehensive and conducted in a very quick timeline. Can you walk us through the process by which the commission came together and how you approached the study? Kayla, I'll throw that over to you first.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me on today to discuss this really important topic. First, I want to really validate and recognize the importance of DoD purposefully including a number of civilian experts on the Independent Review Commission, including Chair Lynn Rosenthal, who was the first ever White House advisor on violence against women and co-chaired the White House Task Force to protect students from sexual assault, Cindy Dyer, former director of the DOJ Office on Violence Against Women, Dr. Deborah Houry from the CDC, Neil Irvin from Men Can Stop Rape. Even though it was sometimes, I'll be candid, a little hard to feel like we had to translate or explain things, those of us who are veterans, they brought really invaluable, fresh perspectives. Speaking as somebody who served in the military, I feel like sometimes my point of view was really shaped by that, and having those civilian viewpoints was absolutely critical. And they were serving alongside former officers, including Kai and her collaborators on climate and culture, also retired generals, including James Schwenk and James Johnson. I was really honored to serve as VA's representative in recognition of the fact that we serve survivors of military sexual trauma and also have seen harassment continue veteran on veteran once folks enter our system of care. So it's imperative that we have unified efforts to tackle culture change and ensure that we're well positioned to provide seamless care and implement complementary changes within VA. We are standing up our own sexual harassment and assault prevention, survivor care and support governance body right now. And I'll be bringing the insights I gleaned from the DoD IRC back to VA. In terms of how I approached the study personally, it was both professionally as a VA senior leader, member of the Biden administration, and longtime advocate and researcher on these issues. But also, frankly, it was very personal for me as a survivor of chronic sexual harassment in the military. I was junior enlisted during my service in the Army, a member of the group that we know is at highest risk. So I'm acutely familiar with what that population experiences and was really deeply honored to bring that voice to the work.
That's great. Thank you. And Kai, is there anything that you'd like to highlight from the process?
Absolutely. And again, thank you so much for having us and for digging into this incredibly important issue. I think one thing that is absolutely essential about this IRC and the way that we approached our work that differentiates us from some of the previous really heroic effort was the intentional multidisciplinary approach as well. Kayla talked about the diversity of civilians and service members and the essential perspectives that those bring. But also what's important is that there's an incredible breadth of lived and academic experience that was brought. We had legal experts, and we're hearing a lot about legal, former prosecutors, retired JAG officers, but we also had experts in behavioral health sciences, in social work and victim care, in military effectiveness, in clinical psychology, in having stood up organizations to work for. And that's something that is very unique about this, that not only did we approach this through the lens of what policies and legal systems have to change to better care for our victims and better ensure that perpetrators are actually dealt with in a meaningful way, but also brought in people to understand what sort of organizational structural changes to the military workforce has to take place. What aspects of culture and climate do we really need to address through a systems change approach to get at this topic? So I think what was very unique in the way that I approach this, much like Kayla as well, from a professional sense, from a academic who studies gender integration and military effectiveness side and really focusing on that culture, but as a survivor of military sexual assault myself. And so bringing those perspectives together is, I think, one of the most unique things about this, so that we weren't just focused on what laws and policies need to change, but how do we dig in to the experience that victims and survivors are having, but also how do we meaningfully change the culture to ensure that zero tolerance really does mean zero tolerance.
And Kai, you worked primarily on the Commission's focus on climate and culture, though certainly you have a good background on all 4 lines of effort addressed by the Commission. Can you talk us through the Commission's findings and recommendations that really stand out to you?
Absolutely. And I do encourage everyone to read our full report, or at least as much of it as you can. It is incredibly comprehensive when it comes to not just what our 82 recommendations actually are, but how we got there and how to implement them. And that's, I think, another thing that's important. We didn't just sort of throw spaghetti at the wall with these recommendations. We were very deliberate in timelines and what systems and structures need to take place. And I think I'd like to start this by saying that our recommendations are really designed as a comprehensive and complementary package to one another. That these are not designed to be one standalone recommendation and forget the other ones. That as we go through this discussion today, even though there's been a lot of focus on one or two, those one or two aren't going to be successful if we don't address the entire suite of recommendations. It is, as Lynn Rosenthal, our chair, would often say, there's a lot more meat on the bones than just changing the legal structure. And so I think to talk about some of our recommendations, we need to first address three big findings that cut across all of the lines of effort. And I know we'll talk more in depth about these findings as we get into our later discussions, but I just want to highlight them now to help frame the rest of our conversation. The first is a lack of trust in the system. And this is one that exists regardless of how much individual service members care about their commander or feel cared for by their particular commander. There's a feeling that the system itself isn't set up to succeed. And I'll discuss a little more about that in some of our recommendations in a moment. The next is a huge gap that exists between the experiences of the most senior leaders and the junior enlisted who are most at risk. That's there. That there is a huge gap in not just understanding policies, but we often say, but cultural gap that exists between these two groups in terms of discussions of sexual norms, in terms of discussions of engagement with the cyber domain and environment. And that's a part of things, that big chasm needs to be addressed. And finally, that victims carry a heavy burden that doesn't go away just because a case goes to court. That this burden, this is why having Kayla on the commission was so essential, that this burden also doesn't go away the day that they separate from the military or get out of uniform, that there is a lifelong burden that is carried. So with those key findings in mind, some essential recommendations. So very briefly, LOE1, our accountability line of effort, has gotten the bulk of the media attention because of some of the congressional work. And there are really two big findings for there. One is the creation of the Office of the Special Victims Prosecutor, which is absolutely essential. And this isn't just, removing decisions from the chain of command, but really deliberately giving expertise to prosecutors to handle these really hard cases. We found out that, or we know that prosecuting a sexual assault or sexual harassment case is not easy. And we need very specially trained people to do it. And the next sort of big bucket of recommendations coming from there is around amending the UCMJ to more deliberately deal with harassment, to ensure that we can have judge-alone military protective orders to protect victims, and to give more specialized authority to looking at harassment as part of the continuum of sexual harm. On LOA2 for prevention, a big focus was that far too often, prevention and response are conflated with one another. And most commanders actually don't understand how to do prevention. They do a lot of awareness raising, but actual prevention is a science. It's a public health science of how to stop behavior before it gets worse. So in there, we recommended workforce studies to stand up an actual professionalized prevention workforce to aid commanders. These are people who are specialized in the science of prevention. And also recommendations to stand up offices to research perpetration and what actually leads to perpetration. The DoD has been investing a lot in understanding victims and victims' care, and that work is absolutely essential. We need to keep doing that. But we also need to better understand what leads someone to be a perpetrator so that we can prevent harm from ever happening. And so there's a big focus on digging in more on that. So I want to focus then in now on LOE3, climate and culture, of which I was a part. I was honored to be joined by two other veterans with me. Bridget Bell, who is a West Point grad, currently finishing up her doctorate in clinical psychology, and Chris Fuhr, also a West Point grad, who's now working with Army Force Comm on gender integration issues as well. And the approach to climate and culture was to take our combined command experience and look at what do we need to fix to ensure that some of these great changes were actually stuck. And what we learned is that if we looked over the past 50 years, there had been several really good policy recommendations made, evidence-based policies. However, they were essentially planted into salted soil because the culture and the climate never got addressed. And so our approach and our recommendations fall into three big buckets when we look at climate and culture. One is that we need to elevate the issue of sexual assault and harassment prevention and response to victims as a readiness issue. This can't be dismissed as just a training issue, something that we say, okay, we have, everyone did their SAPR training this year, let's check the box and move on, but that this is a fundamental readiness issue. We lose nearly 16,000 man hours every single year because of early retention loss to sexual harassment and assault. If we lost that much time to anything else, we would be investing heavily in its prevention and getting at the root of the problem. One of the reasons we found that this isn't invested in a meaningful way is that it's not categorically captured as part of the readiness system. So that's one of the first things we need to do, really elevate that issue. And that has to do with changing our readiness reporting system that's done, but also using some inward focused tools that are part of the 2017 Women, Peace and Security Act to elevate the prevention of sexual harm against our own service members that are there. So these tools do exist already. Next is that we need to select and train the right leaders. So this is using more qualitative feedback to actually understand who's good to command. Just because you're technically and tactically proficient does not mean you're set to lead people. So really looking in and addressing what that is, how we gather qualitative feedback, 360 reviews, how we're screening our future command teams for social acumen, because their main job is leading and taking care of people. With part of that too is executing on the principle that the cyber domain is an essential part, and educating our command teams on how to engage with the cyber domain is a key part of what we also have to do as part of developing and selecting those correct leaders. And finally, we need to look at how our data and our climate surveys are helping us to get the right leaders. The DOC surveys, right now we have a once a year survey that's out there to get the sense of climate, is often not timely. It doesn't provide super actionable information that's there. And so we need quicker tools, things that can be pulse checks on a unit. We need ways to operationalize the finding of these surveys and hold leaders accountable to addressing climate deficiencies before they become a long-term problem. So that's a super high-level overview of some of the key findings that we have, and a little deeper dive into why the climate and culture is so important.
Thank you, Kai. Kayla, you focused on victim care and support, though again, you and Kai both have a good background on all four lines of effort and how they interweave with one another. Can you talk us through the Commission's findings and recommendations on victim care and support, and then any additional points you'd like to raise from the report as a whole?
Absolutely. And I think Kai just did a fantastic job giving this broad overview. I think one of the other things I want to raise about the report as a whole is the importance of thinking about sexual harassment and assault as existing on a continuum of harm, and the need to focus, early on issues about harassment instead of allowing that to fester. So on line of effort 4, I was really deeply honored to collaborate with Indira Hennard, Executive Director of the DC Rape Crisis Center, and Chris Rose, former Deputy Director of the Office for Victims of Crime at DOJ. We jointly developed the victim care and support findings and recommendations after conducting extensive meetings, listening to briefings, sending out requests for information, and holding individual conversations with consultative and subject matter experts Current and former sexual assault response coordinators, or SARCs, and sexual assault prevention and response, or SAPR, victim advocates, as well as hundreds of survivors who took the time to share their experiences and unvarnished views of what improvements needed to be made. The resilience and courage and tenacity that survivors displayed were a daily inspiration to all of us, though, if I may be candid, hearing their stories was at times triggering and deeply depressing because their experiences were so similar to what I saw and experienced 20 years ago. So our line of effort was charged to conduct a review of clinical and non-clinical victim services to ensure that they are comprehensive, evidence-based, and available to all victims, regardless of reporting status, and to develop recommendations on trauma-informed, victim-centered mental and physical health care. And first, let me note that we do believe, as Dr. Hunter noted, that the success of this line of efforts recommendations is interdependent with proposals from the other LOEs. Overall success in reform efforts is dependent on those recommendations interlocking. And crucially, after hearing from victims, speaking with junior enlisted service members, and meeting with victim response personnel across the services, we concluded that for many victims, the institutional response to sexual assault or harassment constitutes a second assault. Victim blaming, unwillingness to give primacy to the needs of survivors, inability to access necessary care, failure to provide regular updates on case status, and innumerable other inconsistencies, both small and large, combine to form an institutional betrayal. A really distressing number of survivors chose to leave the military, not as a result of the assaults they experienced, but rather due to their perception that the military fundamentally did not care about the harm they suffered. And further, a concerning number of survivors revealed to us that they had experienced suicidal thoughts or even made attempts. Allowing the status quo to continue would constitute a failing not just ethically, but also, as Kai discussed, in terms of readiness. Given that approximately 20,000 active duty service members experience assault or harassment in a given year, it's really imperative that the military is able to provide them with adequate care and support so they can do more than just survive, but heal and prosper in the military and after their transition back to civilian life. DoD has a duty to support service members who experience assault and harassment during their service to our country, and our recommendations lay out a path to allow the department to do so better. Access to care and delivery of services are inconsistent both across the services and National Guard Bureau programs. The current SARC and SAPR VA workforce is fractured, inefficient, and under-resourced, and relies too heavily on personnel who are serving in collateral or part-time duties. Moreover, survivors' needs are not consistently prioritized nor well understood by command, exacerbating barriers to recovery and reintegration. And finally, training for SARCs, SAPR VAs, leaders, and chaplains across the services is inconsistent and often lacks a skills-based approach that is victim-centered, trauma-informed, and culturally competent. The result is that the quality of care for survivors is not only different between, but also within each of the services. The core philosophy underlying our suite of recommendations is simple. Victim care and support must center the needs of survivors. Service members who have experienced sexual assault or harassment have suffered a profound moral injury, which must be acknowledged and redressed. I'll talk briefly about each of the main recommendations, but also echo Kai by encouraging folks to read the full report for details on each of their sub-recommendations and the rationales behind them. First is to optimize the victim care and support workforce to ensure that these invaluable professionals have the required expertise and necessary independence to perform effectively. Second, to expand victim service options to meet the needs of all survivors of sexual assault and harassment. That should include both confidential community-based and VA care, as well as peer support. Third, center the survivor to facilitate healing and restoration. And the key theme in all the sub-recommendations here is to increase victim agency and control over the response process. We also recommended studying the methods our allies have used internationally to make amends to survivors, including restorative engagement, and to acknowledge harm and potentially victim compensation. And finally, to re-envision training and research to improve victim care and support. And that would include establishing a training center of excellence, enhancing services for service members who identify as people of color, LGBTQ, religious minorities, and men, to update training modules throughout PME, and conducting research to continually improve services. I'll stop here with this really high-level overview so we can maximize time for discussion at the end. But let me close by speaking directly to survivors of military sexual harassment or assault. We at VA believe you, and we believe in you. VA offers comprehensive care and services, including for many MST survivors who are otherwise ineligible for care. So please go to va.gov to learn more. Thank you.
Thank you both for bringing the Commission's findings and recommendations to light for the whole audience. We'd now like to bring in our two additional panelists, Dr. Coreen Farris and Tchen, to join in the conversation. As a reminder, please feel free to use the chat function to submit your audience questions, and we will address them later in the conversation. So I'll start with Dr. Farris. Dr. Farris, you were part of the landmark RAND study team that identified the impact of sexual harassment and assault on military readiness and retention issues, and in fact brought some quantification to the issue. Can you talk us through the highlights of your study and your findings, and what recommendations you might find? I think you're on mute.
I am sure I'd be happy to. First, I just want to express my appreciation to Kayla and Kai and all of the IRC members for their work. This was a colossal task and an effort that could easily have taken years, but the quality and the insight that they achieved in 90 days is remarkable. I, for one, am grateful, and I want to say thank you. So to the question of the intersection of sexual assault and readiness or retention issues, acknowledging first the human toll of sexual assault on survivors, I'm afraid that I also have to acknowledge that insight into the deleterious consequences of sexual assault for victims has not always been enough to motivate decision makers to prioritize this topic. And in face of that, one tack that's been taken by many is to highlight the potential workplace consequences that trauma can have for employers. For the military specifically, the cost borne initially by victims may translate into problems with unit cohesion and morale, readiness, and reduced retention of otherwise qualified service members. That certainly jives with what victims have been telling us all along about the consequences for their military careers, and it's also consistent with the academic literature on lost productivity. The problem was that without being able to really precisely quantify those costs, you get plenty of head nods from people who already prioritize the issue, and healthy skepticism from those who prioritize other issues. It simply wasn't compelling enough to say, well, there may be consequences for readiness, or it might lead to premature separation from the military. So in this report, we wanted to provide that precise quantification of the number of person hours associated with separations that are earlier than would be otherwise expected had that person not had experiences that the UCMJ would categorize as a sexual assault. To do so, we relied on data from the RAND military workplace study, which includes assessments of past year sexual harassment and sexual assault. And we linked them with military personnel records that are maintained by the Defense Manpower and Data Center. Those records were prospective, so we were able to look at career progression, retention over the next 28 months after that year that had included either harassment or assault. Separation from the military can be predicted by lots of other things, some of them quite strongly. So it was important to control for those other things. Our findings control for a whole host of person-level characteristics like service branch, pay grade, occupational group, deployment history, for enlisted service members, AFQT scores, among other things. Even after controlling for all of those things, we found that sexual assault in the past year was uniquely associated with subsequent separation from the military. It increased the odds of separation by 2. So it works out to be about 5,600 separations. Of course, some of those people would have separated anyway, but our analysis suggests that there were 2,000 more separations than would have been predicted had that sexual assault not occurred. Sexual harassment also uniquely increased the odds of separating in the next 28 months by 1.7. And that's important because many more people are sexually harassed each year than sexually assaulted. And so the number of separations is larger. So of the 117,000 who had been harassed, 28,000 separated over the next 28 months. And of those, we predicted that 8,000 wouldn't have separated, would not otherwise be expected to separate if they hadn't been harassed. We tried to quantify that effect in a variety of different ways. Certainly different ways of presenting things can tend to speak to different people. So another way to think about it is that 1% of all separations are associated with sexual assault, and that 4% of all separations are associated with sexual harassment. We also wanted to think about manpower years. So if you think about all the people who separated who were not otherwise expected to separate, that is people who were eligible to re-enlist, and then conservatively imagine, well, if they had re-enlisted, they would have re-enlisted for 2 years. That's the minimum re-enlistment period for some groups. So if we take that as a conservative estimate, what we estimate is that the Department of Defense is losing about 16,000 manpower years that otherwise would not have been lost. So what to make of all of that? One take home is that there are considerable, measurable costs in the loss of qualified personnel. Another is that there's a large number of separations that are uniquely associated with sexual harassment. And so what we take from that is that even though sexual harassment is seen as lesser or lower on the continuum of harm, it actually represents the more significant cost to DoD in terms of personnel who are lost. And from that, it follows, as recommended by the IRC, that it is critical to prioritize prevention and response to sexual harassment in addition to the work on sexual assault.
Well, thank you for those insights. So turning to Tina. So Tina, your experience is in the civilian sector. Our discussion today has understandably been focused on uniformed service members, but you've spent years addressing issues of workplace discrimination, sexual harassment, and sexual assault in the private sector. Can you talk us through some of the major trends that we see in civilian workplaces or places of education, and efforts that you also see to combat that in your experience?
Well, thank you, Kate, and I am delighted to be here. In addition to my current work as president and CEO of Time's Up and the work that you cite, during my time in the Obama White House as executive director of the White House Council on Women and Girls, and in that capacity, I really, together with Lynn Rosenthal, oversaw the work from the White House that we did during the Obama administration to address military sexual assault. I recall I had monthly meetings with the head of the SAPRO office, with the leadership at DoD to try to address this issue at the time. So it is something, and I'm a Blue Star mom, I feel this deeply personally from that personal involvement. And from Time's Up, we have stepped in to take an active role working with the IRC, working with the other advocacy groups on this issue, because we are working for safe, fair, and equitable workplaces for everyone. And the military is the ultimate workplace, right? You all know this. This is a workplace unlike any other, where you don't just go home to your own house at night, or if you're assaulted and need a break and you can go home to your family, you can't do that without permission, potentially from the commander who is perpetrating. I mean, this is a workforce unlike any other, and a sacrifice by our volunteer military members that I honor and feel an obligation to work as hard as we can to give them the workplace that they deserve, one that respects their contributions and lifts up their skills and keeps them safe and respected, no matter who they are, who they love, that is, what we expect, our country to do for our military service members. And so we're very, very committed to this. But I am struck, as you point out, Kate, by the similarity of the themes of what we see in the IRC report to what we have been experiencing as a nation over the last 3.5 years with the surge of the Me Too hashtag that Tarana Burke started, the actual creation of Time's Up in the wake of the Harvey Weinstein allegations that were published about 3.5 years ago in October of 2017, and this awakening that although, let's be clear, sexual harassment has been unlawful as a matter of federal employment law in the civilian side for over 30 years. And yet we are in this moment now where you can't go a day without another headline in another industry of another workplace where things are happening. We just saw it happen yesterday in the Attorney General report from New York. We saw it last week in the California suing Activision Blizzard. This is ongoing and pervasive and not solved by any means in any industry and in any sector. And I really do have to commend President Biden and Secretary Austin and Chair Rosenthal and the IRC Commission, for taking this on, for doing an incredible amount of work under incredible time pressure, recognizing the urgency of the moment to need to deal with this, even as this is something that has been at the forefront of some of our consciousness for a decade on how to address this issue of military sexual assault, in the military. Some of the common themes, Kate, that you ask about, number one, I would say is power, right? Is understanding that the root cause of a lot of this is power imbalances that exist in our workplaces, including obviously in the military, where when we don't have diverse leadership, we don't have, power relationships that actually set up respect for all. These are, issues, the sexual assault and sexual harassment, are offenses that happen as a matter of exercise of power over someone, an attempt to actually assert that power physically over someone else or around their conditions of their employment and their work. And that's what that is about. And we need to understand that and get to the root cause, which I think the IRC Commission report addresses as well. It's also, I was struck by what Kayla said, that this is a moral injury. Absolutely. I mean, the other common theme is recognizing that these offenses are not like other offenses. I often have to tell companies, this isn't like investigating an embezzlement at your company or fraud. These are very personal crimes that take away the personal agency and bodily integrity that every one of us as individuals expect and are entitled to have respected. And, as a result, the kinds of harms that survivors suffer, the kinds of remedies that need to be made, the kind of adjustments and recompense that need to happen is very different than what you would expect for other types of offenses. And again, I think that the commission report does well, as we talked about earlier, addressing that multifaceted ways in which victim care and support needs to happen and culture change and climate change, need to occur. I will also say the other common theme is justice and accountability is also not enough. It's important. And look, we don't have justice and accountability right on the civilian side either. You can see that in the Cosby trial most recently, that demonstrates that civilian justice mechanisms do not currently serve survivors of longstanding repeat offenders well, and we do not have it right. We don't have it right within internal company accountability measures, but we have to do better, and we have to keep improving those and addressing those. But then we also have to go beyond it, because it isn't enough. We have to actually have that care and support for victims. We know that retaliation is a real thing in the civilian context as well as in the military. 3 out of 4 sexual harassment cases in the civilian side go unreported, the EEOC tells us. And I think it's because the other statistic is that 3 out of 4 of those who do report being retaliated against in some form or another. And so there, currently still exists in the civilian side a tremendous culture of fear, of an inability to feel you can come forward, an inability to know where you can go to for help. Again, similar to what we see, in the IRC's report around the military. And then I will say, that addressing culture beyond also addressing, what goes on, in the specific circumstances of sexual harassment and sexual assault. Overall culture, and I was really glad to see that there was a climate and culture line of effort, because really, if we want to start to build institutions and workplaces where this doesn't happen in the first place, that's our ultimate goal, then we have to get to the root causes of culture and try to change those. And here's where actually I think the military has a leg up on the civilian side. You all know how to actually do climate and command control and culture. When you put the effort into it and lay out the tools, because you have that ability within the military to define a culture, define your values, train to those values, reinforce those values, and how folks do their jobs, how their jobs are evaluated, how promotions occur. Who are you valuing as you promote? I was so delighted to see that there are, recommendations that get at that issue of how do we evaluate commanders? What qualities do we view in commanders? That's actually an advantage I think that the military has to make culture change in a way that corporate America doesn't necessarily have. And finally, so important, I don't want to lose this thread, the important, reinforcement in the IRC that there is a line from sexual harassment through to sexual assault, through, we have sadly seen, to crimes like murder that happen, that these, perpetrators exist on a spectrum. They're often escalating from one low, starting with sexual harassment as a gateway to worse behaviors, all the way up the line. They're repeat offenders. And we have to recognize, those small microaggressions are they're not harmless. They're not things that can be ignored. They are the things that create the toxic culture and workplace cultures that we don't want. And again, I think I commend the IRC for addressing that and really recognizing that. I think it's something we did not do a decade ago when I was working on this within the Obama administration. We focused at the higher end because of the crisis that, thanks to Rand, we knew the numbers of. But it is really important to address sexual harassment on that spectrum as well if we want to stop worse things from happening before they happen, to try to keep the women and men in the military that we want to keep in, and to really, again, create eventually that workplace where it doesn't happen at all in the first place. Thank you again to the IRC for doing this, and to CNAS for having this important conversation.
Thank you, Tina. So we'll open up a moderated panel discussion here, and then we'll follow it on with some audience questions. For Kayla and Kai, the IRC report, a consistent thread throughout is that the bond between commanders and their subordinates is broken. Why do you think that is, and how do you think we can go about restoring that? I'll pitch it over to Kayla first.
Sorry, Kai. I think one of the issues, as Kai alluded to earlier, is there can be some pretty significant gaps in age and other areas. And one thing I'll say I remember from my time in the service is that sometimes that gap is significant enough that junior enlisted folks are engaging in acts of sexual harassment that if you don't know the language, you could hear and not recognize. Terminology changes. I'm now old enough that, the kids these days, I barely know what they're saying. But if you have gotten far enough removed that you don't know the slang, you don't know the lingo, you could literally witness and hear sexual harassment and not recognize it and step up to stop it. Another thing that we heard really consistently when we were doing interviews is that junior enlisted folks did not believe that their leaders took these issues seriously. For example, folks were very consistent in saying that if they showed up with their uniform wrong in some way or in the wrong uniform, there would be immediate consequences. Maybe as mild as you have to do push-ups, maybe more significant, but somebody would step up to do an on-the-spot correction. And they did not believe that to be true if their leaders witnessed sexual harassment, and they did not necessarily believe that there would be consequences if they reported sexual assault. Everyone knew someone who had reported an assault and not been treated appropriately, and perpetrators had not been held to account. And these things combined to contribute to that fractured trust where they don't believe that there will be accountability, and they don't believe that they will be properly cared for if they do step forward and report. And I'm sure Kai has a lot more to add to that.
Thank you. And I think one thing to address sort of on the upfront that's important is, this issue of trust more than even a bond that's fractured. Because I think what we heard a lot was even, especially junior enlisted service members who felt that their commanders were, what they would say, be good commanders who had a good interest in heart and prepared them well to do their jobs, didn't have the ability in this topic. And I think when we look at where this broken trust comes from, we really need to look at some of the structural things that have led to broken trust, and then some of the cultural things. And Kayla hit on a big chunk of the cultural. So I want to talk structural a little bit. One of them comes from how military justice cases actually tend to be handled. And this is what led to this whole focus on the creation of the Office of the Special Victims Prosecutor, was that this is a very small number of cases. But what we found is that often JAG officers are unprepared to actually bring these cases to trial, or that commanders actually wanted to send a message that they were being tough on this issue to try to do the right thing, but they preferred or referred a case to trial before they actually had sufficient evidence to make it a case. And so it ends up in acquittal quite a bit just because of how these cases are handled. When you see that, that leads to a mistrust in the system despite really good intentions behind it. And so when we look at these structural considerations, same thing to have to do with the idea of professionalizing the prevention and response workforces. Kayla talked a lot about the victim care workforce. A big part of professionalizing that is that commanders often, and with good reason, it's really not part of your job up until you show up in command, understand the background of the psychology of trauma or the sociology of group dynamics after they have engaged in a group shared trauma. And so we'd often hear too from a command perspective, and our LOE spend a lot of time interviewing commanders trying to get to what Tina was talking about here, that culture and climate issue. How can we better prepare their leaders for that? And there we heard time and time again, I don't understand why a victim is acting this way. I don't understand why a victim would want to do this. And again, it's not coming from a place of ill intent often. It's coming from a place of, I want to help, but I don't understand. So you end up inadvertently hurting. So when we look at this structural perspectives that are there, we've put a lot on commanders, and commanders are such a linchpin to climate and culture. We've put a lot on them for an issue that is incredibly complex, requires specialized skill sets to both prosecute, prevent, and care for on that side. And when we don't give the skills to commanders to do that, even the best intentions end up perpetuating a harmful culture that's there and leads to this broken trust that, like, there's nothing I can do. Why would I report? Why would I get help? Because the system is set up to fail. And one more aspect, I think, just on the cultural side that's there, is that there are still, and I am sure this exists on the civilian side as well, a lot of outdated gender norms that are perpetuated that allow for the sort of passive acceptance of several rape myths out there. And even if they would say, I think if you ask someone sort of face to face, like, do you think it's a victim's fault? Do you think that she was asking for it? Do you think that, in this situation, it was okay for you to violate her consent? Everyone would say no, but these deeply, deeply ingrained gender norms about everything from what women should and shouldn't do just in society to what family structures look like, right? The military is still very much built around the idea that you have a male service member who is a sole income earner with a stay-at-home female spouse who is able to trail whatever his job happens to be. And that has perpetuated these outdated gender norms that are so deeply ingrained. Again, and there's huge structural components to what leads them there that allow for this tacit acceptance, even things of like, oh, I can't believe a woman would ever do that. You're automatically dehumanizing that person now because you're not seeing them as an equal. You're not seeing it as the same. Or, oh, well, what would that's just a thing that exists in society when you have men and women together. well, no, we can, as Tina talked about too, we can change behavior and train out of it. So I think that those deeply, deeply seated, misperceptions about gender norms, those essentially like old held beliefs, and a structure that still hasn't fully addressed the fact that the majority of service members aren't white men with a stay-at-home working woman spouse. It's going to be really hard to get at some of these deep-seated structures that are fracturing trust of these young women and men who have raised their hand to serve.
Tina, do you see any consistent themes on the relationship between leadership or other structural components, so HR departments and individual employees in the private sector?
Well, oh, absolutely. Right. It is absolutely the same. We know, this is why, 75% of sexual harassment cases in the civilian side go unreported, and that number is really not changing even over the last 3.5 years, because even as companies have tried to do better, tried to create multiple ways, it used to be much like in the military, you were supposed to go to your supervisor, right, as your source. Well, what if it is your supervisor? So a lot of companies have tried to set up, hotlines and tried to create multiple avenues for reporting, and yet still they don't trust the system, right? The HR systems, because HR systems in companies are wholly insufficient. We've got perpetrators who, don't get dismissed, get a slap on the wrist, or, that actually then the retaliation occurs. And I often, we see retaliation oftentimes not in the immediate moment, right? Folks are smarter than that, right? They're not going to demote the woman right then, but wait a year. Right? Wait till she's up for promotion of the year, or wait till when their offices get rearranged. And now all of a sudden who finds their desk is now off the C-suite floor and way down in the basement, and who gets invited to the client dinner or not. If that retaliation starts to happen in undefined, subtle ways over a period of time, and yet everybody gets the message, and that message then goes throughout the workforce, right? Folks then know that, and you have that broken trust. And the other piece that we haven't talked a lot about, but I do think is reflected in the findings is, these are survivors who have experienced trauma. So to that point that Kyle was just talking about, why does a victim act a certain way? She or he has been traumatized. Why don't they remember exactly the exact details of what occurred to them in that first moment? Why are they adding embellishments or details later? They're called like embellishments, not actually how, as we know, the chemical changes that go on in the brain when trauma occurs, how memory comes back, right? And how details come back or are lost or suppressed chemically by the brain, which is what happens, right? And that's why these crimes are unique and need to have that understanding attached to that. And commanders need to understand, how those issues are unique and need to be attached to that. So it is absolutely still the case, Kate, that broken trust, as you describe it, which is so much even more important to the military, because I recognize literally people's lives are in the hands of their commanders and their bosses in a way that doesn't exist in the civilian world. And yet people's careers, their livelihoods, their lifetime earnings, not just their earnings in the moment, can be affected. We did a study at Time's Up on the lifetime loss in earnings. 25% of sexual harassment victims report significant financial loss as a result of, the harassment they experienced, and then the job loss, or moving their job, or leaving as they do, as the military was described, as Dr. Ferris said. We've got folks leaving on the civilian side their careers and taking lesser paying jobs because of, the harassment they experienced. That trust exists across the board as well.
So looking at the leadership of DoD on the uniform side, there's been a lot of attention to the lack of diversity at the top ranks, the most senior ranks. And that's not just necessarily it's more white men than any other category, but also that different, the combat arms are heavily drawn from in leadership, and that other areas of focus throughout the military services aren't necessarily represented at the top. So for the Kai and Kayla, do you see implications of the lack of diversity in what we see culturally with respect to the way that military sexual assault and sexual harassment is handled? And we'll go to Kai first this time.
Yeah, I think, when we're thinking about leadership and the lack of diversity, I think we need to dive down a little bit more to like what we mean and what those implications might be. You know, as Kayla noted, there's one big issue with a lack of diversity, and it's just a lack of understanding the culture and language of other people if you haven't deliberately tried to do it. And so that's one of an impact that's there. I think when we're talking about this, before we even get into the diversity conversation, one of the most important things that we need to talk about this gap that leadership is contributing to is in the cyber domain. With what we see is that, you know, I remember very, very vividly after the Marines United scandal in 2015, the Commandant of the Marine Corps being, you know, visibly shaken of, I had no idea something like this could happen online, right? That's it's a generational difference, but I think is exacerbated when we talk about a lack of diversity there. Because now, not only is there a technology or a skill or a thing that you are there, but you have surrounded yourself because of how we pick, I think to your point, how we select not just who's in the senior leadership, but who surrounds you as aides and advisors. You pick from your known quantity often that's there, that there's no one there to push you, that you need to look at things differently. Another thing I think that's important, and we address this in the climate and culture LOE, is some of the difference between senior officer leadership and senior enlisted leadership. Because if you look at senior enlisted leadership across the service, you actually have much more diversity in terms of gender, race, and ethnicity. And to a small extent, sexual orientation, but at least when we're talking gender, race, ethnicity, there's a lot more diversity on the senior enlisted side. One of the things that we address in the climate and culture report is also empowering senior enlisted leaders a lot more than we currently do. We put a lot on the officer side. And I think when we're talking some of the structures and the legal side, the way things work, that's a different conversation. But when we talk climate and culture and we talk, you know, impacting real change for our junior enlisted service members, those senior enlisted is who has the most contact, who has the ability to shape those conversations, who has the ability to shape, you know, enlisted PME, staff non-commissioned officers, courses and engagement. So I think a big part of this diversity conversation also has to be on how are we better empowering our senior enlisted leaders who both have grown up through a system that is the most vulnerable, who have been through those ranks, who often have experienced it, but also because of the nature of how military recruitment and retention is done, often tend to be much more diverse in ways that the officer corps isn't, because of, again, a lot of these historical legacy structures as to how we pick senior officer leadership. That to combat some of this huge chasm that's come from a lack of diversity, we really need to lean on our senior enlisted a whole lot more than we are right now.
Kayla, is there anything you'd like to add to Kai's remarks?
I don't know that I can add much because she's very thorough, but I will note that while I'm not at all a gender essentialist, and you know, I recognize that folks are different across the board, and there can be men who are extremely compassionate and women who are not at all compassionate. We heard from a lot of survivors who said that they did not get the care and support that they needed until they were reporting to a woman, that they were more likely to be given time to seek care and services when they had a woman NCO or a woman commander. And I think also that may be partly related to the fact that it can be a little easier to speak up and advocate for your needs when you're talking to somebody who you think may be more likely to understand your experiences because you have something in common with them. And so having more diversity in leadership positions to enable and empower folks to come forward and request what they need because their leadership looks like them across a variety of diversity metrics, I think is another important component of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Tina, looking at similar dynamics within the private sector, do you see a relationship between diverse leadership and across a number of metrics and diversity of experience and different outcomes regarding sexual harassment and assault in the workplace?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I absolutely, I believe that it is the case that if let's talk broadly first, in the broad context, if you want a workplace that is based on respect and safety, and equity for all, then you have got to have diverse leadership up and down the wage scale, right? You've got to have it in the C-suite, you've got to have it on the shop floor. And we're talking about across the many dimensions of diversity. So race, ethnicity, gender identity, sexual orientation, people of color, disabled workers. You really need to have that, to have, not just with the specifics of, as Kayla talked about, being able to have someone who understands what it's like to be sexually harassed or assaulted and administering those, but to create that diversity of viewpoint, that kind of overall culture where everyone is respected and not ridiculed for who they are or what they might say or do or what they wear, whatever cultivate. And look, we know that actually diverse institutions and companies, there's this growing body of research that empirically demonstrates that those companies, and I would submit this would be true for the military if they got there, those companies that are more diverse in their leadership have more success, right? They have higher returns on investment. They have higher, sales, and they have higher retention of their staff. The most striking one was the Wall Street Journal did a piece about 9 months ago that took the Drucker Management Institute's measurements of successful managers across 5 domains, and they wanted to see those who score the highest and those who score the lowest. What's the common denominator? Is there one between companies that score high on the Drucker Management Institute scale and those who score low? What is the one thing that was consistent both on the high and the low? Number of women in management. Number of women in management across the board, all 5 domains. Those companies with the most women scored the best on management. Those with the lowest scored the worst. The only consistent finding they could find. And that then carries through all of it, including how we address sexual assault, but also how you include efficiency. How do you include command structure? How do you include, the ability to actually perform all of the tasks within the military, not just this one?
Yeah, that's an encouraging finding. So one of the other consistent themes that we see throughout the report was the specific impact that sexual harassment and assault had on the LGBTQ community. And Dr. Ferris, I know you've also done quite a bit of research on the readiness implications for sexual harassment and sexual assault among the LGBTQ service member population. So to Kayla and to Kai, we'll start with Kayla this time. What were some of those top level findings and how did you see the LGBTQ community coming up through your research as the commission study was underway?
I think we heard that some of the same issues of increased risk that we know exist in the civilian sector also exist inside the military, and also that LGBTQ status can be a further barrier to reporting. Folks, this did not end when Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed, and that is something that I think we need to be really mindful of. We also heard from folks that when it comes to the training that they experienced, that there were trainers who were not comfortable addressing these topics, who would sometimes skip slides or skip bullets on slides that mentioned LGBTQ topics and didn't seem to even feel comfortable using the terminology. And also from survivors who were LGBT who felt that their specific cultural needs weren't adequately understood by response personnel. And this could be a particular concern when you consider that, unfortunately, there are some members of the chaplain corps who are not fully accepting of LGBT populations, and the chaplaincy is still one of the avenues that folks are encouraged to consider utilizing if they do have care needs. So there are a number of ways that this is under-addressed within both prevention and response, and underexplored and under-researched when it comes to intersectional issues. And so I think that's an avenue that's really ripe for further work in the future.
Kai, any additional comments there?
I think just the only thing, and I will kick it to Dr. Harris to talk about the nuts and bolts of what the findings are, but to echo some of this sort of under research around the intersectionality. One of the things too we heard from a climate and culture perspective quite a bit was that commanders didn't know about a lot of these intersectional issues, or how members of the LGBT community in particular, this is similar with racial and ethnic minorities as well, might be viewing climate and culture. And a lot of this, again, has to do with how we collect data and communicate it to our commanders, and how transparent we are with that data. So I think one of our big findings with this too is that we need to better arm commanders and leadership teams, even more than commanders, because commanders are very formal, on a special type of orders for this, but leadership teams with an understanding of what the particular struggles in their units are, how things are landing and impacting certain groups of people, so that they can address those issues and bring the unit closer to readiness.
And Dr. Harris, you have dived into this research quite a bit. Would you mind sharing some of the highlights from what you found in your research?
Sure. So DoD monitors the prevalence of sexual assault with a biennial survey called the Workplace and Gender Relations Survey. And in the last 5 years, they've added, for the first time, a sexual orientation question as one of the survey items. And that's finally provided a window into the sexual assault risk among sexual minority service members. And so what those DoD researchers in 2018, they estimated that 3.7% of gay and bisexual men experienced one or more sexual assaults in the past year. And that's a rate that's 9 times higher than it is for other men. 9% of lesbian and bisexual women experienced a sexual assault, a rate that's twice as high as it is for other women. And if you take those numbers about risk, the prevalence of different sexual minority statuses, and the total force size, you can look at the risk faced by LGBT members and from a different perspective. So if you were to imagine all male sexual assault victims in 2018, 52% of them would identify as heterosexual, whereas 48% would not. So that is an incredibly outsized risk for gay and bisexual men. Only 9% of men, servicemen, identify as gay, bisexual, or other, and yet they're accounting for 48% of male sexual assault victims. Less dramatic, still quite notable, 23% of service women identify as gay, bisexual, or other, but account for 40% of all women who are sexually assaulted. So 2 things stood out to us. First, it really suggests that the military not only has a sexual assault problem, but more specifically, a problem of sexual assaults against sexual minorities. In the 2018 DoD report, the authors mentioned that there was some ongoing internal research on sexual assaults against LGBT members, and that would be forthcoming. To my knowledge, that hasn't been released, and we really need that information. We really need to understand what are the circumstances of these assaults, what's the motivation, what are the assault tactics of the perpetrator. And I think most critically, we need to learn how many of these assaults can be considered hate crimes that are carried out because of a service member's sexual identity. That could be consistent with what we already know about the whole population of male victims. They tend to be assaulted in military workplace settings. Their assailants tend to be colleagues. Often they're assaulted repeatedly. So we have some reason to believe that these assaults might not fit the date rape prototype that's more common in civilian populations. The other thing that I would note is that now that we have this new information, that about half of all sexual assault victims don't identify as heterosexual. We may need a pretty dramatically different approach to prevention. So Kayla mentioned this a little bit already. The military prevention materials for sexual assault usually make little more than a passing reference to LGBT victims. And I think that that's going to need to be realigned with new knowledge that a substantial proportion of military sexual assaults are directed against sexual minorities.
That's fascinating findings. So we're going to shift to some audience questions. So thank you for the thoughtful questions that we've received thus far. This first question, I think, is posed mostly to Kayla and Kai from Jason. How do you perceive the reception of this report among current senior military leadership? And do you think that commanders are ready to cede authority for adjudicating these issues of sexual assault and sexual harassment? We'll go to Kayla first.
I want to defer this one to Kai because of her current position and her deeper relationship with commanders.
Thanks. And yeah, we briefed this to all of the service leadership, the secretaries and service chiefs, as well as the SecDef in the conversation, and I had conversations up and down the chain. I mean, so I think this really comes again as a matter of framing. There is so much attention paid to a very, very tiny, minuscule part of this report, and it's gotten latched on to ceding authority. And I think if you dig in to first look at the report, the recommendation that to create the Office of the Special Victims Counsel is one of 82 recommendations. So I want to first say that I don't want to conflate the report with this one recommendation, because throughout the report, a very key theme, and it's explicitly stated on, I would say, probably over 2/3 of the pages in this report, is that leaders and commanders have an essential role in preventing sexual harassment and response, in properly responding to their leadership, or to their people, and into ensuring the continued readiness of our services. So when we talk about messaging this and how we engaged a lot and got a lot of positive engagement from senior leaders, this isn't ceding authority for adjudicating cases as much as it is giving a specialized workforce these skills and tools to handle really hard cases. I think there's a lot of like up at arms at first of like, oh, you're taking something away from me. You're taking an arrow out of my quiver. First, I think if you look at the number of cases that this will actually apply to, it is incredibly, incredibly tiny. And commanders still hold full non-judicial punishment authority. And if a case is not referred, it comes back to the commander again for administrative adjudication. So the commander is not getting somehow yanked out of the decision-making process altogether. What it is doing is giving commanders a specially skilled workforce to handle this very small subset of special victims cases to allow them to better care for their people, which is their primary job. So I think we've had a lot of really good positive discussions. I think if you dig into even this one recommendation, the recommendation doesn't start with take something away from commanders. It is create the Office of the Special Victims Counsel, which is a office that currently doesn't fully exist. There's some you can have special victims prosecutors in the military, but there's not a dedicated office, a dedicated career track to give attorneys the skills to actually do this.
Can I jump in just with one observation, Kate, just from the outside? Because I was in the Obama administration, as I mentioned. I worked on these issues from the White House at the time. And we had this debate at the time, because we had the Gillibrand bill, we had out there then 10 years ago. And the President Obama took the view, and I actually personally supported that view, that because of all the reasons I stated earlier, chain of command might be the solution here, because of chain of command, because of the ability of the military to use, that command and control that it has to actually address this issue. And, we took the position, Senator Gillibrand being, an ally of President Obama, to not support her bill, and to give the commanders and give the DOD an opportunity to address this issue. That was a decade ago. And, it has gotten worse, by, Dr. Ferris's and Rand's, numbers. We have the data to show it. We've seen what the work is in the IRC. And so clearly it didn't work. and it did not. And now I think the point about, the underlying findings of the need for professionalism, the need for specialization, and then the which I think Kayla mentioned both of them. I think the cascading effect, even though it's a small number of cases, the mishandling of those cases has an outside ripple effect on how people view the system and how people view these issues. And so I think the time has come, and I will say this as somebody who personally supported keeping it in command and control 10 years ago, that it is now time that we have to come out. We have the experience of our allies. We have the data now to see it. I think now we're in a crisis on this issue within the military, and we've got to address it boldly. And this is one of those features.
So our next audience question I'll pose to the group from Allison. So she thinks, Tina, you're raising, talking about systems such as military in which the culture change can, to some degree, be directed from the top down. But how do you go about creating change from the bottom up, and how do you foster a grassroots culture of respect? So I'll throw that out to the group.
Well,
Tina, we can start with you.
I'll start just because I think it's a great question. It isn't just a top-down effect, and I will give you an analogy from the civilian side. One of the other areas where there is a crisis of sexual assault is on our college campuses. One in 4, students who go to college are going to experience sexual assault during their 4 years in college, which is horrific. And one of the things that we did again during the Obama administration was not only to do the policy issues, around handling cases, but an effort, campaign we called It's On Us that continues to this day at about 500 college campuses. And that was to enlist, the students, especially men, the captain of the football team, the head of the fraternities and sororities on campus, to create a culture, to speak out, to say that join the It's On Us campaign, support survivors, and create an environment where sexual assault doesn't happen in the first place. Because it is, every individual can start to address those issues. When the off-color joke gets told in the barracks, don't laugh. Say that's not okay. When you see, an LGBTQ member, getting raised, and by his, fellow folk, don't join in. Try to get that stopped. Speak out against that. Start to create that culture of respect for one another. And everyone can do that right now, on all of those issues, recognizing that these things start small. Culture is made by small individual moments, right? They're not just made by them, someone actually getting sexually assaulted and murdered. It starts also with those off-color jokes, with this sort of, a nickname that you give someone that's really demeaning, even though you're all laughing and saying, oh, no, we really like you, but we're just going to call you this because it fits you. Yeah, maybe not. Say that doesn't work. That isn't what we're going to do. That's not the culture and the environment. And I think, empowering our young, junior enlisted and, folks on the ground to do that is another way to really change culture.
But I think to chime in here, and I know this might also address a little bit of another audience question I saw around changes to training that is there. Then when we talk about building a bottom-up culture, we first, especially when we're talking about a military context here, have to give the tools to young service members to actually change. So I think to Tina's point, to say, well, you should do this, you should do this, you should do that. Well, if we don't give the tools as to how to, what can we really expect? So one of the things that we highlight quite a bit in the report, in both the prevention line of effort as well as the culture and climate line of effort, is fundamentally rethinking how we train our service members, starting from the day that they walk off the street as Jane or Joe civilian to become a service member. So this includes how we engage with our core values of the services, right? So when you have this new young recruit, and we are looking at transforming them into a soldier, sailor, airman, Marine, or Guardian, now what we need to do is embody them with the core values, but not just that things like honor, courage, and commitment mean jumping on a grenade when your buddy's in trouble in combat, but that it takes courage to step up. And part of embodying and living courage is doing the hard thing and stopping someone from telling a joke or calling a name. That if you claim to embody honor as a service member, that you cannot live honorably and lift others if you are not even just engaging in the behavior, but having, being a bystander, as it were, to watch it happen. That part of the idea of having, personal integrity, which is a big part of our, of core values of the service members, isn't just don't cheat on your tests and make sure that the, nuts and bolts are all tied in and don't take shortcuts when you're doing maintenance on your vehicles, but that personal integrity extends to how you treat other people, what you allow to have happen. We often say, the standard you walk past is the standard you accept. And that has gotten, I think, so focused on the more academic side of things and the practical, tactical application side of things. We need to fundamentally imbue our early initial training, where we transform civilians into service members, with core values focus on preventing harassment and assault. Because that's how we start the groundswell up, because we give them what right looks like. We have a unique ability in the military to not say, oh, this is just a society problem that happens between 18 and 25-year-olds, so there's nothing we can do about it. We expect better and we expect different all the time. This needs to be part of that expecting better and expecting difference, not just, oh yeah, this is someone who will jump on a grenade when their buddy's in trouble, but that they are truly embodying and living the idea that preventing harassment and assault is a core part of their identity as a soldier, sailor, airman, marine, or guardian. I even got Guardian in there, so I'm really proud of myself that I'm not forgetting Space Force these days.
That's pretty good. I just want to reinforce that, Kate. I'm sorry, just to jump in, because what Kate just said is so important. And it is the reason why I've often thought the military could get a handle on this way before the civilian side can, because you do have that ability. And I say this as someone who watched the process of turning my civilian son into a Marine officer. You know how to do this and how to transform, folks. And if you can transform them on this issue with those values, and they are totally consistent with what are the core values of the military, we just have to expand the aperture on how we define those. The promise of actually the military providing the solution for the rest of us is really there. And I really strongly encourage, and I'm so excited about this process of the IRC to actually give life to that possibility.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point that Kai raised there. So I'll pose our last audience question that we'll ask today. So elements of this have been woven throughout a number of the topics that we discussed today, but what do you all think it will actually take to build a supportive environment and culture surrounding sexual assault and sexual harassment? So specifically, how do we build that highly skilled workforce for prevention and response, but also how do we imbue the culture of each of the military services in such a way that it addresses this topic? So I will throw that out to everyone. Kayla, would you like to jump in here?
Sure. I think that a lot of what Kai just said gets at this question in many ways. One thing I'll add as a wrinkle, or something that I don't know that we have the complete answer to yet, is that when we talk to the most junior service members as part of our work, many of them already understood what right looks like and understood that this behavior was problematic. And where they were seeing that not reflected back to them was in what we might call like middle management, so their NCOs. And I'm concerned that we have folks coming in who already know that harassment is wrong, assault is wrong, and somehow they're being enculturated into a military environment where they accept what they walked in the door not accepting. And finding a way to break that pattern is going to be crucial to get folks in the middle on board, because we heard fairly consistently from senior leaders that they can, conceptually understand these issues. And then we heard from folks at the bottom that they do. But folks in the middle, I think maybe we need to ensure that there is tailored training and real accountability at that middle management level to break this pattern where we have folks who seem to think that to fit in or to rise or be truly, a service member, that somehow they need to adopt some of these toxic behaviors that do not, in fact, set folks up for real success. And the association between these negative behaviors and this perception that that's what strength looks like, I think can be really problematic. And understanding that in conflicts of the future, there are different types of strength and different types of cultural competence, and we can't rely on these outmoded and inappropriate behaviors as we try to move forward, both for the human reasons we've all talked about, for retention, and for our ability to really thrive and succeed moving forward in the diverse array of missions that we're going to have to accomplish.
Kai, any response from you?
I mean, I think I hit it pretty thoroughly talking about the cultural values, and I'd personally be really interested in some of Dr. Ferris's findings on this, given the depth and breadth of the research of what potentially we have missed on our view, because she's had a lot more time to dig into this than we did.
Yeah, Dr. Ferris, any closing comments or remarks? You're on mute.
Thank you. I really think that the answer is in sexual harassment. So we know that sexual harassment and sexual assault exist on a continuum. We know that in environments where sexual harassment is high, people are at higher risk for sexual assault, even if they're not even the one being sexually harassed. And sexual harassment just definitionally offers some advantages for prevention that you don't have for sexual assault. So one, sexual harassment is often observable. So sexual assault almost always occurs in private. There's rarely bystanders. There's rarely anyone around. Usually it's just the perpetrator and the victim. And so it's really hard to sort of intervene and stop those kinds of encounters, whereas sexual harassment has bystanders. And so that gives us an opportunity to intervene and sort of change the culture for that particular behavior in a way that we can expect and hope is going to have downstream consequences for sexual assault. The other difference between sexual harassment and sexual assault is a crime. And so prosecuting it requires a level of evidence that almost no sexual assaults will have. It is very, very challenging to prove that sexual assault happened. So in most cases, a sexual assault case is not going to be the case that publicly results in accountability. Sexual harassment it can also be a crime, but there are also early precursors to sexual harassment that don't necessarily meet the legal definition. Those sort of offhand comments, those sexist remarks, that you don't need that level of evidence because the consequence is going to be minor at first. It's going to be a social sanction. It's going to be like Kai mentioned, 10 push-ups for making that comment. But it's going to provide a very immediate consequence for a pretty low-level behavior. And we know from human learning, from really all animal learning, that people learn best if the consequence of the reward happens right away. Criminal trial is not how people learn. But if we can work in environments where sexual harassment is occurring and sort of provide those quick social sanctions to a behavior that we can actually see, we actually can observe, I think that the answer probably lays there. And I forget if it was Kai or Kayla who mentioned too that this is going to really rely both on peers learning the skills to be able to intervene and make those changes, but also those NCOs and other managers who are the people who are actually around to hear these kinds of comments. So I'll stop there. I'm curious to hear what Tina has to add.
Yeah, Tina, you can close us out.
All right. Well, I'll just say two quick things. One is we're going to make some change by actually making sure the IRC recommendations and even more reforms are actually implemented. I will say, from the Time's Up point of view, we as outside, civilians and advocates are committed to doing that and to staying loud about it and to staying on top of this and to enlisting others. There's a little bit of lack of attention to this with the civilian military divide, which I also recognize, and we're going to keep loud to try to overcome that and make sure we keep the spotlight on this. And then secondly, Kate, I'm going to end with your project. I mean, what CNAS is doing around women in the military, around leadership in the military, around, who we're recruiting in and who we're retaining. That's the long-term thing that we need to do, and we can't lose sight of, is to make sure, and especially with this all-volunteer force, that we continue to recruit and support and elevate diverse leadership in the military, especially women, but all diverse leadership.
Well, thank you so much to all of our wonderful panelists for participating in this truly important discussion and timely discussion. And thank you to our communications team here at CNAS for their support in this event. To learn more about future events like this one, you can go to cnas.org and follow to sign up for updates. You can also follow us on multiple platforms, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook. And thank you so much for joining us, and let's keep the conversation going.